right, folks, welcome back to episode 16 of the Builders and Funders Show. Today we've got Charles with us. Now, before I let him introduce himself, just want to give you a bit of background on why you should listen to him specifically, because he's one of the greatest people I've met. Incredible, founder, incredible, and he was an investor. We'll get into that as well. But he's raised over $200 million for the startups he's done. He's had a previous exit. He was building a venture studio where he also funded a lot of entrepreneurs, but now he's back into being a founder himself. So we'll get all into that. But for that, Charles, welcome to the show.
Hey, Burke. Great to be here. I love your name, Funders and Builders. I've always been a builder, and I also did some funding, but I actually like the building more than anything. But you need both, right? You can't build anything without money. So I did some work at a venture studio as a managed partner. I went through the work of learning how to raise money as a managing partner. I said, nah, I like building startups.
Yeah.
So right now I'm building something with a VC, a well capitalized VC, and we're incubating another startup very soon. So
That's absolutely amazing. Now, Charles, whenever I hear about people who have been successful in their careers, you talk about raising $200 million in venture capital, having exits. You always kind of when people listen to this, there's always this intimidation factor of like, oh man, he's done all this, he's successful. Like I don't know if I could ever be there. So I want to take it back all the way to the earliest years, so that just people really get to know the real Charles, not the one who's the most the successful entrepreneur, but the young 8-year-old Charles. Before we started this, you were telling me about how you started coding when you were like 8 years old, which I was around, I think 12. So I think we were quite, similar in ages when I started learning, JavaScript and whatnot. But tell me about those times. Like how'd you get into coding? And then you mentioned like at 18 years old working on these big $1 million projects because they couldn't find programs. Like, tell me about all those stories.
what's great is I'm a Gen Xer. I'm one of those. I'm the generation that got to see things before the internet and after. So I'm very excited about the new world we're getting into. So my dad came to this country from China after the Great Revolution there, because he took an IQ test and he scored really high, like 198, he told me. And they got him and his whole family over to the US, and they had him study this new uh, idea written by these French mathematicians that said, what happens if you combine statistics with algorithms? And that's what we now know as AI. But back then, he didn't know it was AI. And what did he learn that for? Was because the military had him build the algorithms to guide our nuclear missiles, the inertial navigation system. So he was one of the few engineers that built the navigation system that's actually still running right now in our nuclear submarines and our ICBMs under the ocean. And the F-16 was another thing he worked on. So he taught me to code at an early age. I was only 8 years old because he thought that the world would end that the then Soviet Union would be in a nuclear war, and that I needed to learn how to code so I could calibrate all the missiles so we could point them at at our enemy. And there was no mouse, there was no UI. You literally had to calibrate these things using binary math. So at 8 years old, I'm sitting there coding, going, "Oh my God, I need to learn this so that the Russians don't take us out." So we survived that. And what was interesting is around college, I went to UCLA. My first year of college, the first .com boom happened. But what was even more important was Y2K. Everyone realized that all of our computer systems would fail because in the year 2000 it would be oh, and it would think we're back in 1900 instead of year 2000. All of our systems would crash. So all my friends in high school, I had a few parents who they bought bunkers in Ohio waiting for the Y2K crash. You were probably born before or after Y2K, probably after, right?
Oh man, after I was born in like 2006. This is six
Yeah,
years
so you
ago.
missed out on the party because half of us thought the world was going to end, and the other half was like, nothing's going to happen. So anyone who could code was like all hands on deck to rebuild systems. So around late 90s, I dropped out of UCLA. And the one time your Asian parents will let you drop out of college
You got
is
to save the
because,
world.
yeah, is to save the world was they were paying a lot of money hourly for me to rewrite whole enterprise systems for like $100 million companies, and medical systems. Like I was rewriting for a couple big medical corporations, waiting for the year 2K. And so, it happened. Nothing happened. No end of the world. Um, and because of that, I got into tech startups. I got very used to explaining technology to people who didn't know anything about technology. And by then, I gotten very used to enterprise systems. So my first venture into it, I got into was Realtor.com, real estate tech company. Back then, it was a hot, up and coming Fortune 500 company. Not so much now. And we had to rebuild all their systems because of all these new regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley, and all these. And so they saw my background and said, "Oh, you're used to rebuilding systems. You could rebuild ours." And so I got to do a lot of data science there. And then that's when I really focused on data and data science. And back then, we didn't even have the term AI. It was machine learning and predictive analytics. So I did that, did their intelligence system for predicting when someone was more likely to buy or sell a home. And from that, I got a call from a friend. He's like, "Hey, I'm doing this startup." Did that first startup, and then just did one startup after another. It got to the point where I had one that was a real estate startup that was approaching Series C. We raised 135 million. Had another friend call me up, said, "Hey, I'm doing a startup." I said, "I'll help. I got some spare time. All I'm doing is interviewing new engineers." And I got that to Series A at the same time as we got to Series C, just after Series C. And then people were like, "Wow, you could do more than one at a time. Why don't you do three or four?" And so I just started putting my name on everyone's pitch decks. And I realized I got really good at how do you go from idea to product market fit, what is now popular known as 0 to 1. But all of this was not intentional. It was just a coding nerd who understood how to communicate ideas to non-technical people and to build product that people loved. And I had a huge background in user research and understanding how to make things consumable, because you had these really ugly enterprise systems, but your users hated using them. And so that was really the secret of my success, was just I figured out how to make really geeky things cool.
That's incredible. Let's talk about that 0 to 1 process because everyone gets stuck in some portion of it. So let's talk about like the very first step, which is the inception, you coming up with the idea. There's been this rising sentiment around, so like you're an engineer, you know this, but like it's never been this easy to build something in entire history. Like you could be completely non-technical and within an hour have some landing page with some kind of very bare minimum, minimum viable product, some kind of MVP out there. And what that has done is now when you Google any idea, you'll see hundreds of landing pages for that idea. So you've got this false almost sense of oversaturation, any idea you can look at. And a sentiment that I've seen a lot with a lot of people that I talk to, and on the internet, you go on the indie hacking forums or like entrepreneurship forums, everyone's like, every idea is taken. I'm losing my mind. Everything I Google, it's all taken. I want to ask you about this because you've been around, as you mentioned, you've seen it before the internet, you've seen it after the internet, you've seen the kind of rise in startups, and it's continued to rise, it's continued to get easier. When you're coming up with these ideas, when you're at the inception stage of a startup, how do you go about thinking about like coming up with ideas and competition, and like, what do you think about the sentiment in general?
What's interesting is it's getting easier to do startups, but it's also harder, right? Because it gives you this false sense that anyone can do it. And so it's actually a good thing because it's exposing the power of technology, and all the possibilities are infinite. There's still going to be billion-dollar new companies that are coming up. No doubt about it. Before there were some, even my dad was like, "Well, the internet is just a fad. It's not going to go anywhere. Once people get, what are people going to do? Just post pictures all day on there with kittens?" And even today, all your top billion trillion dollar companies are all in technology. And so what we're seeing is a very slow, I would say, integration of technical innovation into our everyday lives. And what technology does is it's very powerful at scaling things. So doing things at a hundred of something or a thousand of something, a computer can do millions and billions and trillions of over and over again. And so breaking a problem down to the point where it can scale is the hardest part. And that's why I always tell people, don't focus on whether it's a tech company or anything. Focus on the problem that you're trying to solve. Then focus on a very specific niche of that problem. Now think about the solution. And then as you're thinking about it, it'll naturally come out where the problems of scaling are. And so a lot of people, they go, I have this cool idea. Someone's going to give me millions and I'm going to be venture backed. The next hardest part is to be able to explain to someone how that little solution goes from, let's say, here's a phone without a keyboard. How to explain this simple little solution into this is $1 billion opportunity. And that's where a lot of the deep knowledge of business and entrepreneurship and technology and everything is, because you got to kind of like 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 a director of a movie. You've got to start off with the first scene, but you've got to be able to paint the picture of what the movie is going to look like before it's even created. And then once you go make the movie, guess what? It's going to be a totally different movie at the end than what you imagined.
Absolutely. So let's talk about like the different things you said. So the first thing is like find a problem, right? A lot of people, even at that, they struggle quite a bit. So there's like a couple of really big mistakes I've seen people make in this stage, where like they go out there and they find a problem that it really isn't a problem, or they go start going around and just try and find anything that they can build. So there's all these different things when you're looking at building a company, when you're looking at, okay, I want to go out there and solve a problem, how do you find a problem that people want solved? Like the famous Y Combinator motto, like make something people want. How do you first find the problem that people want to solve?
It really is that cliche of you solve problems that you want to fix yourself. I had one that was a telemedicine company. I have no medical background whatsoever. I don't know anything about it. What got me into that startup was because of my wife had a rare disease, and I was in the emergency room a lot, and the medication she's on is $600,000 a year, but it's covered by insurance. But the bureaucracy of dealing with the insurance companies and dealing with the doctors and navigating the whole healthcare system, like I had to solve that naturally. And by going through that experience, I was like, wow, if only there was some type of service out there that helped people navigate their healthcare journey. So that startup actually became SteadyMD, which the original was a concierge where you pay 99 bucks and you got a doctor that you could anytime. It's literally, I copied the design off Slack. It was text messaging and you could talk to your doctor anytime and ask some questions. And more importantly, if you had a prescription, the physician had medical assistants that we had scaled out that would help them deal with the insurance part of it. And that was what everyone loved. And then when we create the family plan, people are like, wow, my kids are on there. And now we could talk about our health together. And then it became a chat app, a social media app for healthcare that was totally unintended. None of this was intended, but it all started off with, me having a problem that I wanted to address. And so I think they all have to be, you can't be inauthentic. You have to be genuine. You have to actually care about the problem. Otherwise, you won't spend the hundred so hours Googling and watching YouTube videos about this one silly little subject that no one really cares about except for you until you make it so that everyone else cares about it.
Hmm. Let's say you've found the problem. You've got an idea for like a solution, right? But then you go on Google and you see all these competitors. Going back to my original question of like people, they're really intimidated by the fact that there's just so many of these companies, and usually there's always some company doing some in the vicinity of what you're thinking about. How do you think about competition in that context?
It's a good thing. I think good. Because you don't want to do an idea no one's thought of. Because you may, even if you're a brilliant genius and you figured out something that no one else has figured out, you'd probably, you know, fail before you get to the finer solution. You want to see an industry that there are competitors. And then what you want to do is learn and study what are they doing and how are you different? How are you a differentiator? And what is the one thing that you do that's different from everyone else? And why is that important? And so I do a lot of heavy competitor research in every idea I vet. Even when a founder comes to me with an idea, the first thing I do is I go through the competitor research. And I don't do it because of anything. You'll find there's several types of competitors. If they're the big Amazon type of competitor, don't go up against them. I mean, they're $1 trillion company. Of course, I would never build an e-commerce platform that delivers stuff to your door. So that just tells me what not to do. The smaller competitors are the ones that I'm interested in. If they're in Series A, Series B, and there's no clear winner in that particular niche, I consider that a good thing because it means whoever is that Series A may not be the winner. Before Facebook, there was a couple other social media apps like Friendster and MySpace. You probably have never heard of what some of them I just mentioned because they were first. They were the first big ones in the social media space. Facebook came in and did it better and won. So I like to look at competitors as, are they too big that I shouldn't even go near there? Or are they just small enough that I can go in there, I could out execute them?
Yeah, let's talk about the differentiator and like the competitor research for a second then. I remember when I was, it must have been 13, 14. I was building the book summary platform I mentioned. I'd fill out these like forms for like to go on accelerators or like pitch VC funds because I didn't even know what I was getting myself into. I was just like, I'll just apply and see where it goes. I remember it asked me all the time, "What's your differentiator? What makes you different? Why? Well, like, why you?" And I'd always get stuck at that question because I'm like, I guess I don't really know. So how do you find a differentiator? You mentioned you go deep into the competitor research. You find these competitors. You find out if they're too big or if they're small enough to be able to out execute. But how do you then come up with these differentiators? How do you come up with ideas to make it better than them?
So that's a really interesting one. So what's interesting is as you come up with an idea, you imagine what your app could be, and then you very quickly come out with a list of 500 differentiators between you and the competitor. Oh, I'm better than Amazon because my packages will be this or that or do this. So you're imagining the problem has never been finding what are the differentiators. The hardest one is to find the one differentiator that you're willing to bet everything on because that's what your competitors can't do. They're at a certain size where they have to maybe appease their current customer base. And so, working at big companies, what I realize is everyone makes fun of how slow big companies move. They don't move slow. I had like at some companies 100 engineers at my disposal, right? Like, it's not they can't move slow. It's because they're stuck because of their size that they have to appease their investors, their shareholders, or their customers. That whatever they do will piss off their existing customer base, and they know that someone is going to do it, but not them. So that's where you have an advantage as a small, nimble startup is you could do things that scare everyone else. And what is that one thing is the actual question. And then the other thing I like to do when I do find that one differentiator is figure out how do I make my first million? And then what do I need to do to go from 1 million in sales to $1 billion in sales using that one differentiator, we call it a wedge, to wedge my way into the market and grow. And how would I, it's like playing chess with yourself. And then how would my competitors compete against it? And knowing that they can't move as fast because I picked a path that will piss off their existing customer base, that I will get to that endpoint first before. And that's the narrative I tell investors that gets some of the checks.
What are some ways you have found that core differentiator in the past for some of your other startups?
A lot of it is actually pretty easy. Most of my startups have a theme. They tend to be complex workflows in traditional businesses. What you find is traditional businesses that are non-tech. They are not Google. They're not like your law firms, your real estate office, your doctor's office. They're heavily underutilizing technology. Their problem is they have too many options. They have too many CRMs and they don't understand how to use computers or how to integrate technology. So, what really you're trying to do is solve their problem with technology for them so that all they have to do is turnkey it. So, if we go back to some of the ideas I worked, I've done telehealth. That one was really about getting doctors. Doctors really don't want to go to the office every day into a doctor's office and sit there and fill paperwork all day. They actually just want to open up their phone and be able to solve problems and let other people deal with all the paperwork. So that's really what we built at SteadyMD. And so we were able to track really great doctors. And by attracting really great doctors, you could track really great customers. With real estate, some of the things that we did was just, the average age of a real estate agent is like 40 something, 45. They don't adopt technology, whereas most home buyers, who has not looked for a home on their phone? And so a lot of the things we did was just automate a lot of the jobs that a real estate agent does manually. I did some legal stuff. Um, there's a lot of interest while working on one social justice app. I found there are actually systemic injustices just because the technology is so old. So an example was during the pandemic, I talked to the Chicago. I just talk with people and they just sit there and tell me their problems, and you very quickly realize how to solve it. In Chicago, um, people have arrest warrants just because they didn't get in the mail the postcard that said they had a a court date, so they missed their court date. And so there's that famous story of the kid that got shot because it was a pandemic. He gets his mail at his dorm. He didn't get a court date appearance at his dorm room address because he was living at home. And so he got an arrest warrant on him. Police officer pulls him over. Doesn't know why he has an arrest warrant. Ended up being a silly arrest warrant. It was because he didn't get this postcard. She pulled out a gun and accidentally shot him because she mistook her taser for her gun. Very famous BLM story. And if you look at the underlying root of that problem, it was because the court system is so antiquated that they are still sending things on by postal postcards. When if he had an app on his phone that notified him his court date and what to do, this wouldn't happen. And then you go interview the prosecutors. Like I do a lot of user research. I actually interviewed a bunch of prosecutors. And this idea, by the way, is still out there for anyone to solve. And you go do the research yourself, you're going to see the same thing. Literally, the prosecutors have no time to follow up on any of their cases. They have like 100 cases a month. And so they're like, I would love to have an app by which I could coordinate with people who, are in the system and to notify them a court date. And I could actually have something that tells me how am I doing as a public defender. They don't actually have a computer system. I literally watched as she was flipping through piles of manila folders. And then what they call automation is they would scan it into text, into images, and share that in their internal system. And the only way for you to access it is to go to the courthouse where they have 4 computers on VPN, and there's a long line to this computer system. I'm like, why can't this be public? They're like, we just don't have engineers to work on this. We don't have the budget to do that. So that's just an example of just a day in the life of where I'm just sitting there talking to some random lawyers, and then that led me to some prosecutors. I'm just like, wow, we actually have people in jail because our system is so antiquated that there's no mobile app to tell you when you should go to court.
Wow. It's
There's thousands of those. I see those every day.
so I guess it's going back to the inception question. We could actually say if maybe you don't observe particularly any problems that in your own life, like kind of you did with your wife gets a disease, and that kind of lets you to leads you to this path where like, oh well, this is a problem. You could also just like pick a niche and then go talk to the people and like shadow them, or like talk to them about their day in their life and everything they do. And as you mentioned, often they might actually tell you something that they need solved, and you could just solve that, and next thing you know, you've already got a product with a differentiator in your hands.
Absolutely. If you literally don't have any problems, the world is not without too many problems, right? You could just pick an industry. I'll just pick one, real estate. Go to a real estate convention and just ask people, what is one problem if I could wave a magical wand that I could solve that you would want me to solve? And you'd be surprised. Everyone answers that question differently. And that's how I ask all people when I first meet them. Like, if I could wave a magical wand, what problem could I solve in your life? And then you don't even have to do much more after that. They just start talking. And in real estate, it's going to be a very real estate problem. In this case, with the justice system, it's a very specific problem with the justice system. Everyone's got a problem that they deal with at their job, at their work, in their personal life, or whatever. That there's something that they wish could have made it easier.
And then let's say you've decided, okay, I've got a problem, I've got a differentiator. You talked about communicating. So one thing that made you really good at what you did was not just the fact that you could identify opportunities and build something to solve, these problems you were observing, but also it's the fact that you could communicate them. You got good at being able to explain technical things to non-technical people. That gave you almost an edge, a competitive edge over most of the other people that you were presumably competing with. If you're a young, let's say, like, take me, I'm 18 years old and I've got a lot of bunch of friends around me who are 18, 19, 20. They're thinking, okay, I want to build a startup, I want to solve these problems. How do you get good at communicating? Like, what are some tactical ways where I can, let's say, someone like me can get better at it?
Oh my God, you've got such an advantage in the modern age because there's so many good communicators out there right now for you to emulate on YouTube. And you're getting practice right now doing what you're doing. Um, what's interesting is if I had to tell any young person or any founder what's the number one skill you got to learn is communication. Communication will not only solve all of your business woes, it will solve all of your personal woes. I've been married for 20 years. I have children. It'll solve your family problems. It solves everything. Communication is a one thing that if you learn is the most important thing to do. And it's the hardest thing to learn. And so what you're doing podcasts, what I'm doing, practicing with you, this is all we're in the gym. We're training how to communicate. Some things that I've accidentally stumbled upon is take anything technical and try to explain it to someone who is completely non-technical. Irony is one of the most interesting communication exercises I had was when AI hit and the Screen Actors Guild was um, on strike. And my friend invites me. He's like, "Can you talk to these writers and actors about the future of AI and how it's not going to really take away their jobs? How it's give it a more positive thing." I said, yeah, I could do this. I could explain AI to anyone. And then I sat in a room full of writers and actors, like, okay, I need to take a deep breath and take a step back. And they've never actually seen AI. And so the first thing I did was I opened up ChatGPT and I just did a prompt. I said, write a story in, about Harry Potter, only as a comedy, and do it in the style. And I'd have a writer say their favorite name. And then when they physically saw what ChatGPT did, they literally just dropped to the floor to just like couldn't believe that just like this is what the news has been telling us about. And that was the first thing I realized in communication was like, oh my God, you always assume people know something, but a lot of people they get their information off the news. And so they had imagined ChatGPT and all of this as this crazy thing that they watched the news on. They never actually thought to go into ChatGPT and play with it. So after we played with it for a little bit, then the questions start coming. Then the concerns. I get now why, Fran is fighting so hard. This is, and I opened up Midjourney. I said, okay, give me an example of an image. And this is all stuff you do all the time, right? Like you play with this technology. Most people don't even actually know what they don't know. And so in communication, you have to have that patience to take a step back and make sure everyone is first has the same set of facts and information before you talk about it. And so one of the best ways I've learned is to teach my daughter anything. She's only 4 years old. You want to be good at communicating. I think the best communicators are her preschool teachers. You take any hard subject that you learn, you try and teach that to a 5 year old, an 8 year old, your communication skills will instantly go up 100-fold.
Interesting. So here, my like, I have two takeaways from what you just said, and I
Mhm.
want to see if I'm correct in this. So first one is basically this idea of like Richard Feynman of like if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't really understand it. So if you want to get good, actually an intentional exercise you can do is take something really technical like AI, learn all about it, and then get like a cousin of yours, or maybe you have a kid, or maybe just like find somebody, maybe find your grandma
Yeah,
or some elderly lady who's sitting alone in the street, and go up to her and try and explain to her in a way that she's going to understand everything about this tech. And so if you just keep doing that over and over again, you actually get quite good at simplifying. And then the second is in any conversation, there are always underlying assumptions that kind of affect the way you're communicating, affect the outcome. So
hmm
if you don't address those underlying assumptions, sometimes you don't always get the most positive outcomes. Kind of like what you mentioned with the writers, where you don't actually know their underlying assumptions. You're just in the room with them. But if you through skillful questioning, you just keep asking and keep explaining to them in real simple terms, those underlying assumptions come out, and if you let them come out, then you can address them and you can get to a positive outcome. Am I correct in those two takeaways?
absolutely. And you're doing a wonderful job communicating by reflecting back what I said. So now we've built trust because I understand you hear me and you heard me and you listen to me, and that is a hard skill. I would put that as a third point for communication is listening, and that exercise about the 4 year old, you could actually now build that other muscle of listening of go find someone that knows something that you don't understand. For me recently it was acting and singing. I don't have any musical talent. And I met some actors and singers. I said, you explain to me what acting is and what singing is and all the techniques. And you realize that you can take any subject in the world and someone knows way too much about that subject. And it could be the most mundane subject, it could be baking bread. And someone out there is an expert in that. And so what you do is you get very good at listening and realizing that you don't know everything. So I could assume all actors are dumb and don't know anything. That's not true. Actors acting and singing is a very hard skill. And then when they get into tone and pitch and all of these things, you very quickly realize, wow, it's as deep a subject matter as coding.
Yeah. Speaking of information, in our age, so I was, as I mentioned, I was born in 2006. My generation was basically born into the internet. And the problem is, in our age, and for generations before us, it was a lack of information. For us, it's actually too much information that we struggle with. A lot of friends, I was talking to one of my friends, particularly the other day, and we're talking about everyone now, because they're overexposed to information, can't even, I mean, like everyone's just overwhelmed. Everyone's anxious, especially the people I talk to that are my age. They're struggling like really badly with just the fact that there's always more information coming at them every single day. Social media, you go out there, email, everything, just like all through all these channels. Something I find really interesting is when I speak to people like yourself, they always have ways of designing their information diet in a way where they restrict the flow of information. They go to get information from specific places. This I think Sean Purry calls it this idea of like an info diet, basically. I
Hmm.
want to ask you about that. How do you manage your own information pipeline? What are ways where you like, limit that knowledge, like information coming at you? What do you do for your personal life?
I love that question because we're from two different generations. Yeah, it went from both literally and metaphorically information diet and dieting food. I literally saw when I grew up, there were no, like, I was a fat kid and I wasn't that fat. like literally to yeah, and so back then we had neither access to good quality food or good quality information. um, you ate whatever mom made, and we didn't have enough money to eat in a restaurant. It was whatever leftover dad left over for us was dinner. He got the good parts. To now, you have, if I want to learn anything, there's like 500 YouTube channels and so much information. Same with food. It's cheaper for me to cook, cheaper for me to buy fast food than it is for me to cook in some instances. And how do I get away from that temptation? Well, as someone who's seen both sides of it, I think the first thing is acknowledging that you are in a world of abundance, whereas I lived in a world of scarcity. And to see that as a positive thing, it's better to have too much information than what my dad went through, which was communist revolution, which was you believe whatever the government told you to believe. And that was their only source of information. And if you said no, you just weren't alive anymore. You are in abundance. And so the discipline that you have to deal with in abundance is totally different. The other thing is that I do is my serious passion is actually around psychology and mental health. I built a startup. I seem to build a startup in everything I'm passionate about. So I built a mental health startup, and that was the one that got acquired. So what I learned a lot from that is to really study how the human brain works, the cognitive bias says, and realize that our brain has not changed at all in 50,000 years. So if you took a baby from 50,000 years ago and brought them today and raised them up, that kid would be just as normal as you and I. So the human brain has not changed. Look at what's changed just in 10 years, 20 years, 40 years. Our brains were not designed to absorb this amount of change. And so you got to keep yourself grounded. So I do a lot of mindfulness. I do a lot of meditation. Heck, I actually don't keep my phone with me. I keep a pad of paper. As a someone who's been coding for 40 years of their life, 30, 40 years of their life, I try and stay away from my computer as humanly possible. Because I find once I'm in front of the computer, I see it as work. Whereas right now, when you are in front of your computer or your cell phone, you see it as work, entertainment. You see it as everything. Like when you put your phone away, you get that anxiety. It's like, what happens if someone contacts me? You have to break that connection with technology. Otherwise, your brain will just be overwhelmed by the amount of information that is sucking. And then to be able to just sit there and just write or draw or do something silly, like stare at your kid playing on the swings or anything, you have to have that time off because I'm glad you talked about anxiety. I've been dealing with anxiety myself, and it really is about letting the computer, that brain, rest and to not try and know everything. You don't need to know what's happening in the news every day.
Interesting. Speaking of, kind of like mental health, anxiety is one of them, but I think a lot of founders, some that they also struggle with, and something I've seen myself personally go through as well as others is loneliness. Because you're a lot of people tend to not be builders; they're consumers, and they kind of have these normal lives where they go to their job, they go back and they consume. But for a builder, life is very different, and sometimes that tends to lead to feelings of loneliness. I think Brian Chesky did a podcast where he was talking about how building Airbnb he was miserable because he felt so alone. Now you've obviously people can look at your life and say, okay, $200 million raised, exits, this, that, he's successful, he has it all, but obviously there are things you've had to struggle with. I'm sure that people didn't see a part that was a part of the journey, and I'm sure loneliness is always something that comes up. Have you learned to deal with that? How do you deal with that? How do you combat it? What do you do about it?
It's funny you mentioned that. I've actually dealt with that during the pandemic because of my wife's disease. I was locked down actually up until last year. So I actually didn't see any human being other than my daughter and my wife for uh, 3.5 years. And so that was one of the topics I was really doing because something about Zoom calls doesn't work. Like, I don't know why. You still need, well, I do know why. We're social humans. Our brain from 50,000 years ago was designed to be around other people. And so that loneliness you talk about is very real. I end up being I end up being the therapist amongst all the founders because one thing that helps them is knowing what's going to come up next. So I always set expectations like, yo, dude, you're about to run out of money. This is what your next 3 months is going to be like. It's going to suck. Oh, you just raised money. This is what your life is going to be like. Everyone's going to be asking you for money. You're going to have to say no, and it's going to suck. Like setting up the expectations for what the next 3 months have is an is a something I have that a lot of first time founders won't have because it's their first time. So that adds to the anxiety. The loneliness is because you are going through an unusual journey that most people don't go through. And so what I suggest is, and I do it myself, is I hang out with other founders because only founders know other founders' issues. Just like someone who's been through child abuse, only other people who've been through child abuse understand. So find the community that is most closest to what you're passionate about and embrace it and go hang out with them. And then the other important thing is to have some friends who are not doing what you do, because that's an interesting thing. I used to have only friends that were engineers. All my friends were coders. And so during the pandemic, I sought out friends like actors and people who are artists, totally opposite of what I do. I realized they have the same issues that on their end. An actor can't explain to you their life because there's so few actual actors that make a living. Or an artist, what a hard life they have, right? Most people don't understand an artist's life. And so when you hang out with people who are not doing what you're doing, you you tend to have more empathy that what you're going through is probably the same thing everyone's going through, just a different flavor of it.
Really interesting. I want to shift kind of the topic from some I personally struggle with as well. It's talking about struggles on that theme. When I was building my first startup, I would talk to people about it, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about what I should do. And I was recently talking to yet another friend of mine, and he says, "Yeah, I started building this thing, and everybody in my school, he's a senior in high school, everybody has an opinion on what I should do. Everybody I talk to, everybody's telling me do this, do that, And I had the same thing, and over the years, I've kind of intuitively gotten a bit better at tuning feedback and looking at what I should take and what I shouldn't take, but I still struggle with it personally because like you talk to investors, they tell you all these different things you should do. You talk to other founders like, "Oh no, we tried that, you should do this." It's always hard because, Peter Thiel talks about like be a contrarian, go do what you believe is true, but then, they'll also say, "Well, listen to feedback, listen to other people." how do you build that, like, feedback filter? How have you personally built it?
What's funny is, as a data scientist, that's all I do is I filter out information, because the hard part is not getting the first hard part is getting it, then cleaning it, then filtering out, and then you're going to naturally put a bias on that data, which is going to affect your system later on. And so I actually practice kind of what I actually do, which is, first, what I do is I take a look at the device, and I don't take it personal. I first go, okay, is the advice I'm getting from coming from an expert? That'll filter out a lot of advice. Because if you go to the gym and you see someone who's Mr. Olympian and he tells you how you should work out, I would probably weight his information very high. That's actually how I found my personal trainer. Is I just go into the gym and find the strongest, most buffest guy there, and I go, "How do you do it?" You'd be surprised how many people tell you how to lose weight or work out who don't look like that. And so I go, "Thank you. That's really nice." And I filter out. So, number one is, first, cleanly filter it by objectively going, is the information I'm getting good? Is it coming from an expert? Is that person an expert in their field? So if I hear an actor talk about, geopolitical politics, I'm going to ignore it, because if I need an actor to teach me how to project my feelings onto the screen, yeah, I'm going to take notes. That's a master class. But if that same actor is telling me something not in their core competency, I'm going to filter it out. So, first, where is the information coming from? How much of an expert are they? Then that filters out, I would say, about 80, 90%, and frees up your brain to actually process it. Now, if it's an investor, that happens a lot, where I'll have an investor who's an expert in, let's say, real estate investment, but give me advice on how I should structure the data structure. I was like, okay, I get what you're trying to tell me, but you just fell out of the core competency of what. Now, if you told me a great strategy on how to increase the valuation of how do I evaluate a property as an investment, I'm going to take notes. But the stuff he talks at are like, oh, but your app should have a button that does that. I'll be like, okay, I'll scratch that out. And what he's really trying to tell me is his pain point is he wants to solve by some solution. It's not necessarily a button on a website. And so that's how I really, really cleanse and filter data before it enters my brain. Then, once you get all the experts that are relevant to what you're trying to solve, then you got to realize that they might be right 50%, 52%. If they're brilliant, there's still 48% chance that they're wrong. So you got to sit there and say, okay, are they more right or more wrong? And then if you go up against the expert opinion, just realize it's all right, because they're not doing your business. Because unless they are making all the same decisions that you're making, it doesn't matter what they think, because at any one point in time, one decision doesn't make or break a company. And so your business is really your business as a founder CEO. And the title of CEO means you're the final decision point. So the majority of the decisions that you have to make as a founder that are contrarian to what everyone else believes is actually a very small number of decisions, because 90% of the time you're going to agree with your other co-founders or your employees. If an engineer says, I need to do it with this tech stack instead of that, I'm not going to die on the cross, arguing against him, because he's going to be doing the coding, most of it. I'm just going to be doing the code review. So I have to learn a new language to code review. Big deal. There are going to be a couple decisions where you're going to go contrarian, because you know a lot more than everyone else does about the problem, that you're just going to have to say, guys, I know you guys don't agree with me on this, but we're going to have to do it this way. And this is why. And that's the final thing about why there's anxieties about making contrarian decisions. Elon Musk, I think, is the most brilliant at this. He will tell you his answer and why he did it. He will explain in great detail. why he chose it. And he'll even flat out say, I might be wrong. But I've seen him explain why he did the 4280 battery the way he did. And even chemists are like, well, I could be wrong. you know, like he made a contrarian decision around that, how to dry the cells, and he was right. Same with the space shuttle. The NASA guys told him, it's not going to work that way. And they're like, okay, we were wrong. But at any one point, Elon Musk could go in great detail as to why he made that decision. And so that is, I think, more important. Is it's not just the decision is important, but you need to be able to back it up with why. Because if you can't, then you're probably not going to be confident in that decision anyways.
Interesting. I want to ask you about one other thing that's a little controversial for founders. This is something I've talked with a few VCs, and they had their different opinions on it. I want to get your take because you are a builder. You've been a builder for a long time. You've been in the trenches, especially in the early stages of building a company. What should your schedule look like? Because there are people who talk about the 4-hour work week and just like being very relaxed about your schedule and say you work a couple hours and then just kind of like wander or whatever. And then there are people who are like Jensen Huang was talking about CEO of NVIDIA. He says all I do is work 7 days a week, 24 hours. All I think about is work. All I do is work from the time I wake up to the time I sleep. So you got both sides of the spectrum. What is your take? What do you think the schedule? What kind of schedule does it take on a daily basis to be a successful founder?
That's one that's interesting because I've grown up from a generation. That's what you're probably hearing, which is in order to be successful, you have to work hard. And as a data scientist, the answer is actually no. There is no data behind that because what really people are seeing is uh, cause versus effect. If someone, there are many examples of someone who was successful that didn't work long hours, as there are people like Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk is an outlier, but if you look at the actual data, most entrepreneurs, there's this picture of an entrepreneur as having like Steve Jobs. And I remember actually, I worked for some of the prior original co-founders at Apple. And so I got a taste as to what Steve Jobs was like before he became famous. It's really a personality thing, the hard work. The end result, I could argue at scale, doesn't matter about your work. Matters more on the other things, luck, timing, um, opportunity. You could even all that because if you look at like just the divorce rate, if that were true, then that would mean CEOs and entrepreneurs have a wildly worse divorce rate than any other group. They only have a slightly milder, higher divorce rate. And then you look at across the whole CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, most of them are really boring. Most of them don't have drama like you see on TV. So what you realize, just like most actors aren't like the Kardashians or most, what you realize is this bias is because the news and media is showing you all the interesting stories. And you start thinking that all entrepreneurs are workaholics that can't have a social life, that are abusive to their employees, and that they must work 100-hour work weeks. I could give you 100 examples of people I personally met who are very boring founders, have no, they're just normal. They have their weekends, they have kids, they've been married for 30 years, and things are just boring. And that's what you don't hear about. And that's what in data science we call the average. The average entrepreneur does not have to live like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk to succeed.
So then, how do you? So, like, let's say, obviously, later stage versus early stage are two very different things. One, you're in the trenches building. The other, you're kind of more of a manager. You've got more of a administrative role. But for a founder who's deep in the trenches building, how should they design their early schedule? What should they, you know, how should they structure it basically?
I think after doing it a few times, here's the thing: when you do a startup, you have a list of a million things you need to do, and so why they burn themselves out is because they're trying to do all million things. What I filter it out is what's the one thing I need to do right. I call it the miracle success. What's the one startup miracle I need to do to hit the next level of success? What is that miracle? And then I think that way. I focus on that and let the plates fall on everything else. So I do my taxes at the last minute. I do my QuickBooks at the last time. There's something about urgency, right? Like you have to do what's important and urgent. And so I only do things that are urgent and important. So things like making sure the website looks perfect or my email works perfect or my headers or anything. I don't even care about that. I'm starting a new company and I'm like, I just put together a website AI generated. I didn't even like look at it because I know that website is going to be important. No one's going to go to my website. Um, what they are going to do is they're going to talk to me and be like, what's your business? Show me an example. I need to show one sale that shows them exactly what this process looks like. And so I'm really focused on what that first customer looks like, what that one sale does. I'm doing everything manually, even though I can code. The irony is because I'm a coder, I realize how much time it takes to code and how much it costs to code. The last thing I ever do, and I'll tell anyone who's a founder, the last thing I will ever do is write a line of code in my startup. Because the moment I do that, I know my time's going to be sucked up completely. I know my money's going to get sucked up hiring the engineers, and that's why I'm so excited about no code and low code. It's because I can actually build an app without actually coding. Now when it breaks, I know I'll have to go in there and actually modify the raw JS because no code, low code is still very immature. But I know what I'm getting into, right? So it's like a race car driver. I don't worry about the car so much. I just want to get miles on the odometer.
So if we're getting really tactical, what do those like really core important things? So you mentioned, okay, like really talking like business model, like making the sale. You mentioned some of those, but what if you were like, I mean, because most business functions are quite similar. Like what the founders are doing it quite similar, despite whatever the business idea might be. So what do those core tasks usually look like for you?
So there's this term MVP, minimal viable product, that everyone keeps on using. And I realize that what happens is people focus so much on the features that like I can't do this without this feature and that feature as an engineer on the builder side of it. So I stopped using MVP. I call it MSP, minimum sellable product. I say just to get $1. I don't even care. He's like, just $1. I said, just get $1. What do I need to do? And then very quickly it becomes, oh, you could just print me a PDF and I could get $1 for this. I was like, okay. Now what's the first $500 look like? Well, the same PDF. I could just upsell it to PDF. And so you realize most people are building for an imaginary customer that doesn't exist. Now, the double-sided edge of that is the moment you actually start taking from customers, the average customer has very high standards because they're used to Apple and they're used to that. And so you very quickly realize that you have to know both sides. You have to be able to say, this is what I can get you very cheap. But if I raise $10 million, this is what I can get you. And so that's how I talk to investors. I said, I was able to do this with only oh, $250,000. I built the bare minimum. If to get to the $100 million valuation, this is exactly what I need. And I'm going to tell you exactly where every dollar is going to go. And for some reason, it's going to be $10, $20 million. It sounds like a lot of money, but and so you have to know both. I mean, it's not an or question, it's an and question. You have to be able to sell your product for $1 and know what that product looks like at $100,000 per customer.